Now for our hardware and notions, we are going to need some fast drying fabric glue. This is the one I use in Spotlight in Australia. Any fast drying fabric glue will do the trick. Now we're going to need a dress zipper, which is a number 3, and it's 23 centimeter 9 inches long. That's for the interior pocket. You can use a number 5 if you prefer, but I like to use the smaller one inside, but I know a lot of people have the continuous zips and number 5s and they don't even have any number 3s on hand, so yes, it's perfectly fine to use a number 5 if that's what you want to do. It's entirely up to you. So you need one for the interior pocket. Now that's 9 inches, 23 centimeters. You need a number 5 for the exterior. It needs to be 19 centimeters or 7.5 inches long. I've stitched across the tape down the bottom here to stop the pull from coming off. So I just used the pull that's on the number 3 inside, and I've added my own pull to the number 5 because that's a continuous one. The number 3s, I just buy a whole heap of long ones in various colours, and then I just cut it to whatever length I need. You will need a closure of some sort. I'm using a thumb lock. You can use a rivet magnetic snap or any magnetic snap. I give instructions on how to install this, but if you are confident installing a different kind of lock, by all means go ahead. We need some hardware. I have some rectangular rings. They're 1.5 inch or 3.8 millimeters. You need 2 of the rectangular rings and 1 in the same size slider. And we need some webbing. We're going to cut this in 2 pieces. One for your lower strap, one for your upper strap. So you need 85 inches altogether. And we're going to cut 25 inches off for the lower strap, and the rest we will use for the upper strap, or about 60 inches. 152 centimeters, 63 centimeters is the lower strap, so that's the 1.5 inch size. You can also use some double-sided tape. That comes in handy for installing the zippers. So let's take a look at what we need to cut for our Wanderflap crossbody bag. Now we'll need to cut one body exterior back top, one body exterior back foam, and 2 interfacing pieces. Now what I have done is I have fused my interfacing onto my foam, and then I have fused that assembly onto the main fabric. So basically, let's see, I'll show you this one. We have a body exterior front, 1 main, 2 interfacing. Now I've fused one of the interfacings onto the fabric like that, and then onto the foam I have, or rather onto the other second piece of interfacing, I have fused that to my foam. You can use sew-in foam, fusible foam, or smackdown foam. I've actually used a smackdown foam on this one. I ran out of it, so I'm using an ordinary foam, sew-in foam on this one, and I have just fused my interfacing to the foam. And then what I've done with this one is I've sandwiched the fabric together with the foam and the interfacing. So the foam is fused to the fusible side, or stuck down if you're using a smackdown. And then what we're going to do is we're going to just put those together, and you can either fuse it with the ironing all the way around with an iron, or you can sew it with a long basting stitch with your machine, just to hold the layers together. The goal is just to simply hold the layers together. And this way you won't have to trim the foam out of the seam allowances. So we have a win-win situation. So there we go. That is what I have done there. 1 main, 2 two interfacing for the body exterior back bottom and a piece of foam which I have fused on there. And with this one here, you need to cut that window out of the foam and interfacing before you attach it to that, because you don't want to cut that main fabric at this stage. So basically you're cutting it on this side. I fuse the interfacing on before I cut that window. So once I've fused that on from the interfacing side, I place this there and then I draw my box and cut it out. Or you can do it on the foam side. Well, actually that's what I did. I did it on the foam side. Draw it on the foam side with the interfacing at the back and cut that out. And then when you sandwich it together, you're going to have the window on this side, the zipper. Obviously, if you want to have your zipper on this side, just reverse the process. So like that, and I'll go and fuse that on shortly. For your flap, we need two main fabrics or contrast, whichever one you want to use, and two interfacing, and also a flap fleece, one of. That's going to be the exterior, and the piece where the fleece is the lining side. So if you're using a lining fabric, fuse it to the lining and then put a piece of scrap Decaville heavy on the area where you're going to attach your lock. And we will double check that thickness of the lock is right at a later stage. We need to cut an exterior zipper pocket facing, one lining and one interfacing, and I've fused that there, and I've also drawn my zipper box area onto the back of the facing. We need to cut exterior zipper pocket, two lining and two interfacing, and I've done that, and as you can see I've already fused that there. Phone pocket, you need two lining pieces, two interfacing, fuse those, and then center fuse your fleece onto one piece, and I'll show you which goes where during the construction. Interior zipper pocket, we have two lining, two interfacing, which I've already fused. For the slip pocket, two lining, two interfacing, already fused there. For the card pockets, you need to cut one lining and one interfacing, and the interfacing is smaller. So I've centered that and fused that into place, and that's just to keep the bulk down when we're constructing that card pocket. And you need two body lining pieces and two interfacing, and I've fused those. So there we have it. That's what we need to cut and prepare for our Wanderflap crossbody. Oh, and I almost forgot, you need to cut one interior zipper pocket overlay. I've used a faux leather here, and you can use anything that doesn't fray. Faux leather, cork, vinyl, real leather, anything like that. Or you can just simply do a normal zipper pocket. So you also need to cut one base stabilizer piece from Decaville Heavy. Retrieving your exterior zipper, make sure that it's cut to 18 centimeters or 7 inches long, and I like to run some stitches on the ends just to make sure the zipper pull doesn't come off. Retrieving our exterior zipper pocket lining pieces, our facing and our body exterior front with our foam attached there. And just when you do attach the foam, just try and make sure that these foam little pieces there are centered in the V's there for the darts. So what we need to do is we need to draw our window onto our facing, which I've already done there, as you can see. The lines are 15 centimeters or 6 inches long, 12 millimeters or ½ inch apart, centered in the middle of the zipper pocket facing piece. Now what we're going to do is we're going to center that over the top of our window, and you can feel where that is. I just want to make sure that that's centered into that window. You can mark exactly where that foam starts and ends the pin, and then we're just going to center that in place. So that you can feel that that's right there, and pin. Now you can also just flip it over and double check your placement just by sticking a couple of pins in each corner, or a pin in each corner, and flip it over and double check. And what have I done there? Yeah, that's looking pretty good, so I'll leave that there. Get rid of those pins. And now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch these two outer edges. Okay, so now I'm going to start and end right on the corner point. There. Okay, so I'm just going to stitch these lines. Back stitching there to secure that. Try and end on the point if you can. Just make a neater window. Like that. Okay, so now what we need to do, so I'm just going to grab a stitch ripper, a pretty one. I'm just going to cut in here a little bit, and I'm just going to, this is through all layers, I'm just going to cut down the center, and I'm going to snip right over to the point, taking care not to clip my stitches. Like that. And on the other end, the same. Now if you do happen to snip your stitches, just go back over to the sewing machine and reinforce them. Now we're going to go back to the sewing machine and we're going to edge stitch right along those edges. Now what I like to do is make a mark about 6 millimeters, 1/4 of an inch back from the point, because that's where I'm going to start and stop. Like that. So we'll go over to the sewing machine and top stitch that side and then that side. Okay, starting about 1/4 of an inch or 6 millimeters back from the point, and I'm stitching with a top stitch length of 3.4. Close to the seam. I went one stitch too far, but that doesn't matter, it won't hurt it. You can press this with an iron first, I'm just finger pressing here. Like that. So now that I have top stitched either side of those seams, I'm going to push that fabric through to the other side. Like that. Now I'm going to go over to the ironing board and I'm going to thoroughly press that, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to glue these two sides down to hold them into place. Now I have gone away and pressed that, and I've pressed from this side as well, but it tends to want to always go back, so that's why I'm going to put some glue on there to hold those, because you want to be able to see that top stitching there so that it comes back like that. But don't glue these ends because you'll need to be stitching those later when we close our pocket. So for now I'm just going to run a bit of glue, plop and plop, 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 plop a bit on here. Smooth it out a bit with my nozzle, and then glue this down. And this is where the quick drying glue comes in handy. Do the same on this side. Just remember, don't go past that window, and we'll just glue that down like so. Now if it's not a super fast drying glue, put some weight on there and just let that dry, and then once we've let that dry we'll continue. Retrieve your exterior zipper pocket pieces. Now we're going to need to use just one at this point. Just put one aside. Grab some double-sided tape and we're going to run a strip of that down the right hand side. Remove the backing. Now retrieving your zipper, we're going to place this wrong side down with the zipper pull, the closed zipper pull at the top. Just going to line that up with the raw edges of the fabric, so press to stick it down. Now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch 6mm 1/4 of an inch down there. So now I've put my zipper foot on and I'm going to use a stitch length of 2.4 and stitching 6mm 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the zipper tape. Now we're going to go over to the ironing board and just press that fabric away from the zipper. Now with the fabric pressed away from the zipper, we're going to retrieve our second exterior zipper pocket piece. Retrieve some double-sided tape and we're going to run that down the left raw edge of our pocket piece. Like that. So now grabbing our zipper pocket piece with our zipper attached. We're going to place that right side down so the linings are right sides together, and align those raw edges of the zipper tape with the side edge of the pocket piece. Like that. Press to stick it down so the pocket pieces are even. That's what it looks like. And so now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch down here 6mm or 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the zipper tape. Stitch 6mm, 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the zipper tape using our zipper foot and stitch length of 2.4. Like that. So now we're going to go over to the ironing board and press the fabric away from the zipper like before. Now that we have pressed our fabric away from our zipper, that's the back, and don't mind all the little hairs from my wool mat. Retrieve our front body piece again. Now we're going to run some double-sided tape down the side of the pocket window on each side. Like that. And now make sure that your zipper pull is at the top. I'm just going to align that over there like that. Make sure the pull is out of the road, and align these facing edges with the edge of your zipper. And center that into place like that. Now if you can pin whatever it is that you're sewing with, pin, or use a long clip or something to hold into place, just so that you don't stitch the wrong fabric in the wrong place. Like that. And we're going to go over to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch all the way around our pocket window. So now we're going to stitch around our pocket window using a zipper foot and a stitch length of 3.4, 3mm, 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the fabric. Now you can pull the threads to the back and knot if you wish, but I'm too lazy to do that. I'm just going to do a couple of little stitches backwards to lock that thread. Now to the top and bottom of each end of the pocket, I like to do a couple of extra stitches across there just to secure that zipper, because it's a high stress area. Now if you're going to pull the threads to the back to knot off, try and finish in the hole that you started. I'm just doing a couple of stitches to secure my thread. Like that. We need to flip it over. I'll take these pins out first. I'm just going to smooth that pocket over. I'm just going to pin those sides. Trim off this excess fabric. from that woolen mat. Like that. Now I'm going to go over to the sewing machine, and with the body facing this way up, I'm going to stitch around my pocket. Like that. All the way. Doing, doing, doing. I'm going to put my other foot back on again. Move my needle back over to the centre. I'm just going to bend that back out of the way, and I'm doing it wrong. I'm going to put it this way. This way. Bend that back out of the road. Back. Bend that out of the way. Don't stress too much if you don't keep the exact seam allowance here. It's not going to matter. Going to put my zipper foot back on again, because I'm going to stitch these as close as I can to this little V there, just to give it a bit of extra support. Move my needle back over. So at this point, go back over to the iron and give everything a good press again, because we've wrinkled up the foam while we've been bending and twisting that pocket, the foam out of the way so we could stitch the pocket. So we just need to smooth that all back out again, and then we shall continue with the next step. Retrieving your body exterior back bottom, your body exterior back top, and your foam pocket pieces. Just put these pattern pieces aside. Now we're going to mark the centres at the top here. And making sure that's around the right way. The direction of your fabric. Just going to mark the centre of the bottom edge. Okay, now we're going to mark the centres of our foam pocket pieces. Now the piece without the fleece goes onto the body part, so we're just going to pin those in place. And this one goes right sides together with the top. The bottom edge of the body top piece, like that, because that will go downwards like that, so make sure your fabric is facing the right direction. Now we're going to go over to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch using a 6mm 1/4 of an inch seam. Okay, so I'm just going to put my regular foot back on. Putting my needle back in the centre. Stitch length is 2.4. Just going to stitch this on using a 6mm 1/4 of an inch seam. same with the body. My stitch length is 2.4, 6mm 1/4 inch seam. Like that. So now we need to press our fabric away from our pieces. So I'll just go over to the iron and do that. So now that we have pressed our fabric away from our foam pocket, we're going to put this right sides down onto the body piece. So that's the body back top piece going down onto the bottom of the piece. I'm just going to pin, or you can use clips if you are using vinyl or something that cannot be pinned. And what we're going to do is we're going to stitch from this side to 1 centimetre in from the foam pocket, so about where that fleece is laying. So we're going to stitch up to that point, back stitch to hold, same on this side. So we're not going to stitch in the centre bit at all this time, we're just going to stitch those two outer edges. So now we're going to stitch these two seams, 1 centimetre 3/8 inch normal seam allowance, stitch length of 2.4, back tacking at each end to secure. I'm stitching up to that line there, which is 1 centimetre in from the edge of the foam pocket, and I'm just going across and starting again on this side. Secure. With this pocket pressed open like that, there should be about 3mm 1/8 inch of the exterior fabric showing there, and your pocket pressed open and away from each other like that. And to flip it over, and you can just pin or clip that to hold it out of the way. And the bottom, well, if you can't pin, you might just have to double check and make sure as you go that that's not getting in the road of your stitching. So we're going to top stitch along the bottom edge of the seam, not the top yet, just the bottom edge, 3mm 1/8 inch from the seam line. Okay, so now I'm going to top stitch 3mm 1/8 inch from this seam on the bottom side, and I'm going to use a stitch length of 3.4. Like that. Okay, so now we're just going to remove our pins or clips, flip that over. We're just going to smooth that out, pin these together, and now I'm going to pin this pocket down here to hold it out of the way. If you are using vinyl or something like that, you could actually just pin into the interfacing in the foam and not into your exterior. And we're going to flip that back over. We're going to top stitch above the seam line, 3mm 1/8 inch from the edge. Foam pocket downwards out of the way. We're going to stitch 3mm 1/8 inch from the seam line on the top side, using a stitch length of 3.4. Like that. Okay, so now that we have top stitched the top as well, we need to just unpin this from our bottom thing, and we're going to flip that up like that, and we're going to go over to the sewing machine. We're going to stitch those 3 sides like that. Start and end as close as you can to the top there with that folded over. You might actually find that helpful to clip. Keep that folded and then stitch around those 3 sides. Okay, so now we're going to stitch these 3 sides, making sure that that stays underneath there. Back. Stitching our normal seam width of 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch, as close as we can to that seam. Doesn't matter if it's not exactly close to it. The phone pocket's not going to fall out of that tiny hole. I mean your phone. Like that. So now that we have stitched our phone pocket, we're going to trim this bottom seam back to about 3 millimeters, like that. I'm going to go back over to the sewing machine and stitch that seam again. Okay, so now I'm going to stitch this bottom seam using a stitch length of 2.4. There we have it. I have stitched the seam a second. Now that we have stitched that phone pocket, we can smooth that down, and we're going to go over here. We're going to find the point where the stitching ends or begins and just mark it back about 6 millimeters, and in that space I'm going to top stitch between the 2 rows of stitching just a couple of times back and forth to reinforce those ends there. If you prefer, you can just add a couple of rivets, but I'd add them below that stitching. You don't want to be punching a hole in your stitching, so just sort of put it just below that stitching on each side. You're making sure your phone pocket is down out of the way. I'm just going to do a few stitches to reinforce the ends of our pockets, just between those 2 stitching lines. Really doesn't matter if you go a stitch or 2 over it unless you're really fussy, you don't like for that look. But I'm not that fussy. Nobody's going to see a stitch here either way. There we go. And that will just reinforce those 2 sides of the pocket, because that's a high stress area. Okay, so now we're going to make our darts in our body exteriors. Now before we form the darts, I like to draw in my stitching lines. It just makes it a bit easier to know where to begin and end your stitching. Do that pocket there. You can actually trim a bit of that away if it's in the road. Right. And now we need to form our darts. We're going to go fabric right side together. I like to stick my finger under there to make sure, and smooth that to make sure it's all nice and smooth. Let's see where that point is going to end. Pop a pin in. Do that for the next dart. Just smooth that fabric. Pin or clip to hold. once you have each dart formed, we're going to go over to the sewing machine and stitch. Okay, so now we're going to stitch each one of our darts using a stitch length of 2.4, stitching along that previously drawn stitching line. Sure that you're folding that away out of the road underneath there. Make sure that dart is packed out of the road. And now we're going to do the other body piece, same process. Check all the dots underneath. So now we're going to go over to the iron and we're going to press each of those seams outwards, and then we're just going to baste them to hold them outwards. Just going to run a bit of basting stitching along there. I have pressed my darts outwards, and now I'm just going to baste using a 6mm 1/4 of an inch seam just to hold them laying outwards. Like that. Do that with the other piece. And there we have our darts basted outwards. So now, grabbing your body pieces, we're just going to put them right sides together like that, and get rid of some of these threads. We're going to pin this dart together at this outer edge, or clip if you don't want to use pins, and then I'm just going to make a mark about 1 inch back from the dart, because that's where we're going to begin and end our stitching on either side. So we're right sides together, and what we're going to do is stitch this bottom seam and leave these two sides open. There, so we're going to stitch from 1 inch this side of that dart round to 1 inch that side of that dart. Stitch that seam using our normal 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch seam. Just going to remove this flatbed, just going to make it a little bit easier, and I'm going to stitch from that mark that I made 1 inch or 2.5 centimetres from that last dart. And there, I've stitched that seam. Now, what we're going to do now is we're just going to push this like that, and we're going to open the seams. We're just going to stitch each side of the seam just to hold it open. It'll make it easier when we put on our base. And you won't see the stitching on the other side because we will be putting our webbing on top of it. So if you find those seams are a bit thick there, you can give them a few wallops with a hammer before we proceed. I'll see how I go without the hammer first. I'm just going to change my stitch length to something a bit bigger because it's just like a basting stitch, 4. Just make sure everything's pulled out there. If you haven't changed your needle recently, now might be a good time to do it with these thicker parts. I'm using a jeans size 16. Just pull this over and stitch. Probably stitched up too far there, but anyway, So now I have stitched either side of the seam line to hold my seam allowance open. So what I'm just going to do is open that up like that, and I'm going to get my glue and my Decaville base stabilizer. I'm just going to mark the center of each end. Like that. And now I'm just going to put onto the fusible side, I'm just going to put some glue, because it's very awkward to fuse. If you want to try and fuse it, that's up to you, but I think this is easier. Stick some glue. You can smear that around if you want, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to do it this way. And place that between the two outer darts and the lines that you made, the marks. That goes onto the seam allowance, and just pull everything so that that's going to sit right. Just make sure everything's pulled out. Doesn't matter if it's not exactly in the right spot, but we'll get it as close as we can. And then I'm just going to hold that for a second. Then I'm going to use this thing here to weight it down. Like that. Very clever, isn't it? Very high tech. And I'm just going to leave that to dry. Okay, so now that we have our Decaville piece glued into place, if you're worried about thicknesses when you're sewing on your strap, just give those areas a good whack with the hammer around the darts, even along there if you want to, but just whack that to flatten it a bit more with your hammer, and that should take care of any thickness issues. Now we're grabbing your lower strap, that's the 25-inch or 63-centimeter piece, and we're just going to draw a line across the center half. I'm going to use this bright pink so that you should be able to see it. Hopefully. And just going to draw across 3 inches from the end, from the center again. That's 7.6 centimeters. 3 inches, 7.6 centimeters from that end, from that center line that way, I mean, like that. Or if you don't have chalk or something to mark it with, maybe just put some pins in there, but the chalk is easier. And now what we're going to do is we're going to put some glue on the back in between those marks. This is just to baste it in place. You could use some strong double-sided tape down the centers, not where you stitch. And on this side, I'm just going to mark the center point between the darts, and my darts are a little bit wonky there. I didn't realize that before. Just going to put a mark in the center there. Never mind my wonkiness. You won't notice it once this is basted into place. Now I'm just going to line up outer line with the, or close to that outer dart area. You can also draw a line 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch either side of the seam so that you can make sure that you get that centered right. Just glue baste that there, stick a weight on it and let it dry. Okay, so now we're going to stitch across our strap and then down each side. We're going to start right here. I'm stitching with a stitch length of 3.4. I'm just going to stitch back across. Stitch down the side. About 3 millimeters, 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the strap. Back over to the line we drew before. Pivot, stitch across the line, stitch back, pivot, stay slow and steady. I suggest a nice jeans needle of a size 16, that's what I've got in my machine. And there we go. base and our strap secured on there. You can see it in there. Okay, now that we have our strap firmly in place, we're just going to turn this so that our right sides are together. Tack your strap down into your bag out of the way, and we're going to finish off these two side seams. So either pin or clip to hold. Same on this side. Make sure pockets and everything are out of the way. Actually, I'm going to pin this one from this side because I think it's easier to stitch around from the top to the bottom rather than from the bottom to the top. So I'm going to pin like that. So now I'm going to go over to the sewing machine. We're going to stitch down here and stitch down here. It's alright to squish this down while you stitch. Makes it a bit easier if you do. So now I'm stitching with a stitch length of 2.4, just my regular 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch seam. Like that. And we now have a very squished bag. And it's alright if you catch the foam in some places, it won't hurt anything. Retrieving your rectangular rings, thread your strap through like so, and we'll thread it through just so that the strap is sitting nice and the fold of the strap is sitting flush with your top stitching on the top side of the foam pocket. Now center it over the seam like so, and I'm going to pin this because I'm using quilting cotton and webbing and it's easy to pin. Sorry about my dogs in the background. You may need to glue baste or just hold it as you sew. So what I'm going to do is go over to the sewing machine and stitch across there as close as I can to the hardware, and then I'm going to stitch across again about 1/2 inch away and then stitch a rectangular box to secure that strap in place. If you've got thinner hardware, you may be able to just do your rectangular box pretty close to that, but it's too hard for me with my thickness of this ring to get my diagonal stitches done, so I'm just going to stitch it a bit further away. Or you could also rivet that on, and I'm going to do this, get this one ready as well. I'm going to use my zipper foot, easier. Top stitch length of 3.4. Actually, I find it keeps the layers better together if I start in the middle of the strap. I'm just going to move the needle over to the side. fresh needle here. Now I'm just going to go down a bit further. And to start where it sits, stitch is easy. To stitch a rectangular box. Could spin it around, but it's awkward, so I'm just going to stitch across backwards. To stitch up to here. To stitch across. This side up here. And that's that side attached. I'm just going to do the same on this side. And the good part about using a thread that blends in with your webbing is if it's not 100% neat, nobody's going to see it. Okay, retrieving your flap pieces. We've already got our fleece and everything attached there, so set that aside. Now we're just going to place this right sides together, like that. And we're going to pin around the curve, and we're going to leave this top straight bit open like that. So we're going to go over to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch that seam. Okay, so now I'm going to stitch my flap. I'm using a stitch length of 2.4 and a normal seam allowance of 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch. Okay, so now that we have stitched that, you can either notch these curves, or I'm going to use my pinking shears. Just makes the job easier. I like to trim these corner bits back like that. Now we're just going to turn that right side out, push that all out, run your fingers around, just really push that out. Now what I like to do at this point is I like to get my lock, and I need to remove these screws. just so that I can test the lock. Now, remember the side with the fleece and the Decaville is the underside. So just make sure that that's a nice snug fit, and it is. Now if that was too loose, I would add a little bit of extra padding down there until you've got a nice snug fit. But for now, I'll take that off. I'm just pinning all that so that the layers don't shift. And now I'm going to baste that top closed, and then I'm going to top stitch 6 millimeters, 1/4 of an inch from the edge all the way around the flap. I'm putting my 57 foot on here because it's got this little side thing here which gives me a nice edge to work with, so I get a nice even 6 millimeter, 1/4 of an inch seam around the flap. Slap. Now I'm going to top stitch using a stitch length of 3.4. Basically just basting these top edges together. Like that. Okay, so now what I need to do is find the center bottom of my flap. And then I'm going to center this over the bottom. Now I'm just going to use an awl and really poke this down into there so I get a good hole made already for the screws. They just go in a bit better that way. They're flush. And there we have our lock on flap. Retrieve your body. Now we're going to put this at the back so that that flops over to the front. So what we need to do, right side down, we're just going to put the flap in between those straps. So find that center bit there. Clip if you are using vinyl or something. So that space there is about 2 centimeters, 3/4 of an inch. 2 centimeters, 3/4 of an inch, yes. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to baste that in place. So this is at the back of the bag where the phone pocket is. Baste that in place so that when we flip it over then we can figure out where to put our front latch. I'm just going to take off my flatbed because it's easier. I'm going to put my normal foot back on. Baste this flap in place, just leaving it at 93.4 stitch length. It doesn't really matter, but I'm basting it on using a 6 millimeter 1/4 of an inch seam. now that we have our lock attached to our flap, I'm just going to pull this around. Now what I like to do is I like to pop this in there just to hold it a bit more steady, and I'm going to pull this flap down so that it's pretty, remembering we've got our full seam allowance to do there yet, so I'm just going to make sure that there's approximately the width of those straps there on the side, and centering that between my webbing, and I'm just going to put some marks where those prongs are falling once I find my pen. Like that, and I'm just going to double check by measuring to see that those prongs are actually in the centre. It'd be helpful if I could see them a bit better. Okay, so 12.5 centimetres. 12.5 centimetres. So is that by a little bit? And the other one. Just go this way a little bit, like that. So now I know where I'm going to cut my slits. Take this back out. Move my pocket out of the way. We don't want to be poking holes in our pocket. And just grab the stitch rip. Try not to get my head in the road. Now if you're worried you're going to slip and go too far, just like you do with a buttonhole, just put a pin in so you can't go too far, and cut your slit. Same at the top. Like that. Now I also like to add a little bit of face stopper onto those slits. And if I can get at the back, I'll put a bit on there as well. Can't see it, don't worry about the back. Okay, so now that we have our slits in there, we can pull this back off here. Now remembering which way it goes, I'm going to put that in there, like that. And on the back, I'm actually going to cut a scrap of Decaville. So I have a scrap of Decaville and some interfacing scraps, and I'm just going to see which holes these prongs go into. I'm just going to mark that so it doesn't quite use the whole of the washer thing, so I'm just going to mark that. Just going to make my slits. Now I'm going to put that over the top of the washers, the prongs. Just putting that over the top of the prongs. I don't know if you can see. I can barely see this myself. Let's come out of there. It's a bit hard trying to do this so that you can see at the same time. But I have a piece of Decaville over there, trying to keep this pocket out of the way. Can you see that? Like that. Now I'm just going to put the washer over the top, and I'm going to hammer those prongs down. And there we have it. We have the prongs bent inwards. I like to bend them inwards. That way there's no chance they're going to poke a hole out into my fabric somewhere. And now I'm just going to fuse some scraps of interfacing over the top. If I had some duct tape I would just use that, but I haven't got any at the moment. So I shall fiddle around and do it with interfacing. So retrieving your card pockets fabric, your lining which has the interfacing already attached. Now what we need to do is press the seam allowance under at the top and the bottom. You can either glue or use some double-sided tape or just simply rely on pressing. I'm just going to add a little bit of glue. So I'm just going to pop over to the ironing board and press those two. I'll do that now. Okay, so now with my seam allowances pressed under at each short end, we're going to fold in half, right sides together. Gosh, I've got a lot of mess here. Just going to lightly press a crease down there, open back up, and fold each short end right sides together, not like I was just about to. And I'm just going to add a couple of clips when I can find my clips. Going to pop them in there to hold. Oh yes, the lady that reminds me all the time when I put my clips around the wrong way. There we go. Now put that one into there. Like that. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go over to the sewing machine and stitch those two sides. So now I'm going to stitch each long edge down here using a stitch length of 2.4. Seam allowance is 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch. Okay, so now that we have stitched our two sides, I am just going to trim these corners and turn right sides out. So now we'll just go over to the ironing board and press. So now that we have pressed, we're going to go over to the sewing machine and top stitch those two short edges. So now using a top stitch length of 3.4, just going to top stitch these edges 3 millimeters, 1/8 of an inch from the edge. The two short ends. There we go. Okay, so flip that over so the opening is underneath. Pen. And I'm going to draw a line 7.6 centimeters or 3 inches down from the top stitched edge. And I'm going to draw a line 8.3 centimeters or 3 1/4 inch up from this bottom edge, like that. Retrieve your slip pocket pieces and just taking one of them like this, we're going to fold it in half, right sides together, left to right, and lightly press a crease like that. And now we're going to lightly press a crease to mark the halfway point of this. And we're going to lay that on there, and we're going to place it with the opening side right side down. And the top is 3.2 centimeters, 1 1/4 inch down. And here we go, we'll pin that in place. Like that. Now we're going to go over to the sewing machine, and we're going to start over here, stitch down, across, and down, back to there. So that's attached to your slip pocket fabric, and about 1/8 of an inch from the edges on the sides. Okay, going to fasten my card slot fabric to my slip pocket. I'm going to use a stitch length of 2.4. I'm going to start over here, approximately 3 millimeters, 1/8 of an inch from the edge, but it's not really going to matter that much because you won't see it anyway. Stitch to about 3 millimeters, 1/8 of an inch from the edge, pivot, stitch across to the other line and stitch down, pivot, and stitch across, and there we have it. So I'll just get that out of the road. Now we'll just fold that up, give it a bit of a finger press. Now I'm going to pin it to hold. Can just stitch it in, hold it and stitch it in the next step if you can't pin. Like that. And we're going to go over to the sewing machine. And we're going to stitch down here, cross here and up there. And I'm going to back tack at each of these points here so that it reinforces it because they're high stress points. Okay, so now I'm going to top stitch using a stitch length of 3.4. I'm going to start over here. I'm going to stitch approximately 3 millimeters, 1/8 of an inch from the edge. And I'm just going to back tack a couple of times to reinforce these corners because that's a high stress point. Stitch down to this one and do the same here. And now stitch across, or stitch down to this point here, pivot, and stitch across the bottom, 3 millimeters, 1/8 of an inch from the edge, and back up to the top, remembering to reinforce these corners. Like that. Okay, so now we're going to draw a line down the center of our pocket. So I'm just going to draw my center line in like that. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to the sewing machine and I'm going to start on this bottom edge and I'm going to stitch up, take one stitch and stitch back down. So I'm essentially just stitching next to the line on this side and then back down next to the line on that side, and I'm just going to reinforce in those 2 points there by back tacking just to make it a bit more stronger. Okay, starting at the bottom end of the card slots, stitching next to the line or just slightly to the side of the line, stitch length 3.4. Back tack here because it's a high stress point. And I went one stitch too far. Take one stitch and stitch down next to the line. like that. I probably should have back stitched there, but I forgot. Retrieve your second slip pocket piece, and what we're going to do is we're going to press under the bottom seam allowances. I'm going to glue again. I shall be right back. Okay, so now I have my edges pressed underneath there. Just going to pin this together, or you can use clips, lining up those bottom edges to make sure they're nice and even. Now I'm going to go over to the sewing machine and I'm going to stitch those 3 sides. Okay, so now I'm just going to stitch these 3 sides. My stitch length is 2.4 and I'm stitching 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch from the side. If I start my stitching just back in a little bit, then the threads won't poke out at the bottom when I trim them off. That, leaving this open so that we can turn it. Now that we have stitched that, I'm just going to trim these corners. And turn right sides out. Running my fingers along the seam, make sure that's pushed out. Now I'm going to go over to the ironing board and give that a good press. Now I've pressed that, so I'm going to go over to the sewing machine and top stitch that top edge. Okay, so I'm going to top stitch this top edge, and I'm using a stitch length of 3.4, 3 millimeters 1/8 of an inch from the edge. Like that. Okay, so now that we have top stitched that top edge, we need to retrieve 1 body lining piece. Going to fold that in half to find the center point. Just press a bit of a crease there. Open that out. And now I'm just going to eyeball that there because I can see where the center is. And I'm going to place this 6 centimeters, 2 3/8 down from the top raw edge. And pin. Okay, so now that we have that in the place, we're going to go over to the sewing machine and we're going to top stitch down here, across here and up to there, and back tack at each of those points there because that's a high stress point. I also suggest you check that your foot can fit in that space there so it's not sitting crooked. If it doesn't, then perhaps stitch it on with a zipper foot. Okay, so now I'm going to attach my slip pocket card pocket assembly onto my lining, and I'm going to do this with a 3.4 stitch length, 3 millimeters 1/8 of an inch from the edge, and back tacking at each top point to secure and reinforce. like that. Okay, so now that we have done that, we can put that aside, retrieve our second body lining piece and your zipper pocket overlay. And now we're just going to mark the centers of both of those. Grab this and we're going to align that 2 inches or 5 centimeters down from the top raw edge. And to do that, to fasten it in place, you can either use some double-sided tape or some glue like me. Just going to put a little bit around this outer edge. This is just to get it to hold in place while you stitch it on. Just going to pop that weight on there to hold that down and let that dry for a few minutes. Okay, so now that I have my zipper overlay stuck down, I'm going to top stitch all the way around using a top stitch length of 3.4. Now you can stop in the same hole and tie the knots off at the back, or you can back stitch to lock your threads. Either way is fine. I'm just going to lock mine because I'm lazy, and I'm using my walking foot, which will help to stop any distortion in the final. Like that. Okay, so now that we have our vinyl stitched down, I'm just going to make a hole in this center bit, and I'm going to cut along here. And what I am going to do is I am going to remove this fabric from behind, being careful not to cut into my overlay. This scissors is getting a little bit. Going to use these ones. Now this does not have to be neat because nobody's going to see it. Like that. Okay, so retrieving your interior zipper pocket and your number 3 zipper, or if you're using a number 5, then your number 5 zipper. And we need to grab some double-sided tape. Well, you could glue base this if you wanted to, but I'm going to use double-sided tape for this. Run a strip along the top edge. Peel it off. Now we're just going to place this wrong side down onto the right side of the fabric and line those top raw edges. Made mine a little bit longer there by the looks of that, but that doesn't matter. Press that down. Now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch 6 millimeters, 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the zipper pocket, and then we're going to press the fabric away from the zipper. Now I'm just going to stitch my zipper in place, 6 millimeters, 1/4 of an inch from the edge, and I'm using a stitch length of 2.4. my zipper foot, and my needle is over to the left as far as it will go. I don't want to stitch into that, so I'm just going to move it out of the way. Like that. So now I'm going to go over to the ironing board and press the fabric away from the zipper like that. Okay, so now I have pressed my fabric away from my zipper like that. I'm going to grab my second lining piece, and I'm running a piece of double-sided tape along the top. Whoops, that didn't stick down. Peel that off. Now we're going to place this right sides together with the back wrong side of the zipper, aligning along the top edges. Make sure the sides are even and press to stick in place. Like that. So now I'm going to go over to the sewing machine and I'm going to stitch 6 millimeters, 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the zipper tape. Okay, so now I'm stitching the second side of my zipper pocket onto my zipper tape. 6 millimeters, 1/4 of an inch from the edge, stitch length 2.4. Like that. Now I'm going to go over to the ironing board and press the fabric away from the zipper. So now that I have pressed my fabric away from my zipper, like that, we need to retrieve our lining piece, and we're going to run some double-sided tape on either side of that window. You can glue baste if you prefer. What you need to do is place your pocket with your pull over on the left if you wanted opening from left to right, or place it around that way if you wanted to open from right to left. Personal choice, really. There's no actual right or wrong. So now what we're going to do is just going to line up basically the lines where we've stitched the overlay, go to the zipper pocket edges there like that. Line that up and place that over the top and center that so it's nice and neat. Got that centered how you like it. We're going to go over to the sewing machine and stitch it all the way around that box, but I like to pin this pocket down the bottom here and up the top just to make sure that that stays where it's supposed to and doesn't get in the road of my stitching. I'll put some clips in if you're using something which you can't pin, but I imagine for the lining that won't be an issue. So I have put my zipper foot on and I am going to now stitch around this zipper window. I'm going to stitch approximately 3 millimeters, 1/8 of an inch from the edge, and I'm using a stitch length of 3.4. Holding the thread so they don't get eaten, but I'm just going to lock that off. You can pull the threads through to the back if you prefer. Now I also like to stitch back again here just to reinforce that end. Same on this end. Like that. So now let's turn that over to the wrong side, and we're just going to smooth that down like so, and don't worry, that is not seen. Press that down or smooth it down, and then we're just going to pin those layers at the side here just to keep them together. And I'm going to cut this excess off here so that they are even. And now I'm going to press the seam allowance up, and for this I'm going to use some glue and glue baste it. I'm just going to pop over to the iron and press like that. So now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and we're going to flip it over right side up, and we're going to stitch down this side and stitch down this side, and then I'm going to prune that bit of excess zipper tape off, but stitch the two sides, and we're going to leave this part open because we're going to use that when we finish our bag, because we're going to pull the lining up through the bottom of the zipper pocket to close the lining, and then we will close the lining in the zipper pocket. Okay, so now we're going to stitch the sides of our zipper pocket closed. I'm using a stitch length of 2.4 and I am stitching 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch from the edge. Or approximately. Doesn't really matter if it's not exact. And the other side as well. Okay, so flip that over now that we have our zipper pocket stitched. Now what we're going to do is our darts, but I'm just going to pin my pocket up out of the way so it's not annoying. And I'm going to draw my stitching lines onto the darts, onto the fabric. Just lining the 3/8 of an inch marks up to that edge. And draw a line. And that gives us our guide to where we end our, or begin our stitching. Okay, so now we need to form each dart. Just going to put my finger in under the fabric there and smooth that out and pin to hold. Just make sure that point is right there like that. Grab your second lining piece. like that. So now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and stitch our darts. Okay, so now I'm going to stitch my darts using a 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch seam allowance from the cutout part, but as you can see it tapers off, and we need to start back here at the taper, and my stitch length is 2.4. Hold that under like that. Make sure that point's coming out there. Like that. Now we're going to go over to the iron, which is beeping there in the background, and press those darts inwards like that, and then we're just going to baste them so that they stay that way. So I'm just going to take my flatbed off because I just find it a little bit easier, and I'm going to stitch this, baste this on using a long machine stitch length. It's popped up at 4.10 when I just stuck my finger on it. It's not important. And I'm going to stitch 1/4 of an inch or 6 millimeters from the edge. Just to baste that in place. Now the other one. So now that we have our lining darts stitched, we're going to place these right sides together. I'm just going to pin the outer darts together. There and there. It's just to hold everything in place. Now I'm just going to measure and mark 7 inches or 18 centimeters down from this top raw edge, approximately. It doesn't have to be exact. And I'm just going to mark that because we're going to stitch to there, and we're going to leave that open down the bottom there. So I'm just going to pin that. I like to put 2 pins right next to each other at this point, just to remind me that I have to stop there. Don't want to stitch any further. That's just pin in that dart just to hold it. And I like to stitch from the top down, so I'm going to do this from this side. Like that. So now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and stitch those 2 sides, and leave this bottom edge has to stay open. So leave that open. Okay, I'm going to stitch using a stitch length of 2.4. from the top down to that mark that I made there, and I'm leaving the bottom open. Seam width is 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch. Now I'm just going to back tap a couple of times here because I want to make sure that that's nice and secure. I'm going to do the other side the same. Like that, and remove those. That stays open. Okay, so now that I've done that, I'm going to go to the ironing board and I'm just going to press these side seams open where I have stitched, like that, and the same on this side. I'm going to press that open, like that. Take this pin out, we don't need that there anymore. Retrieving your outer bag, we'll just open that flap and put that like that. Make sure your rectangular rings are down like that. And what we're going to do is we're going to squish this body into this lining. You can decide here whether you want your zipper at the front where the lock is or your card pockets at the front, whichever way you want to have it. I'm going to put my zipper pocket towards the front. My card slots towards the back. I'm just going to push that in there. Pull that exterior out of the bottom of the pocket, out of the bottom of the bag. Just a little bit like that. The bottom of the lining. Keep that rectangular ring down. And manipulate this around. It seems a bit tight at first, but it actually comes together quite easily. So we're going to line up these side seams. I'm going to pin because I'm using fabric. If you're using vinyl, you'll need to clip. And just do the side seams first. They're both open. And then just move things around and ease that lining so it all fits. Like that. So we've got the bottom poking out there, and we've got our lining and exterior right sides together. And now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and sew all the way around our bag. Start stitching here. I always start at the back. Stitching with a stitch length of 2.4 and a 1 centimetre a 1 centimetre seam allowance. I'm just going to snip this bit of extra zipper off here. That. Now, all we need to do is pull the lining over the top of our bag. And now what we need to do is push this lining down into the bag. I'm trying to get my head out of the video, so it's a little bit awkward. And what we're going to do is we're just going to manipulate that with our fingers, just to get that seam right at the top. And I suggest now at this point, go over to your hammer, wherever that may be. Mine's down here on the floor. Now I'm just going to go and hammer this, especially this part here where the thickness is, but I'm also going to hammer all the way around my seam just to get that to lay nice and flat and reduce the bulk, so that when I top stitch it will be easier. Just smooth that all down, and I'm just going to hammer that down there as well. So I'll go and do that now. Okay, so now I also suggest, after we've done all that hammering, that you put some clips or pins. I'm pinning because I am using fabric. So I'm just pushing that all down underneath there with my fingers so that I smooth that down. I know it's going to stay put when I stitch, but if you're using vinyl, then I would use clips for that, because you do not want pinholes in your vinyl. Like that. So now I'm going to go over to the sewing machine and top stitch all the way around, 6 millimeters, 1/4 of an inch from this edge and from the flap seam. So I'm going to put my number 57 foot on here, just to help me get a nice 1/4 of an inch seam even all the way around, starting at the back of the flap, the back of the bag. And I'm going to be stitching with a stitch length of 3.4. Like that. So now we need to take out all our pins. So I'm going to remove all my pins. So now we're going to go through the open zipper pocket, which we just opened now. You don't have to open it beforehand. Grab the bottom of your lining and pull it out. Like this. And we're just simply going to line those darts up, pin, going to start from that previous stitching. Like that. So now we'll go over to the sewing machine and stitch. Now I'm going to stitch the bottom of my lining closed. I'm using a stitch length of 2.4. And I'm starting where I had finished off before, back tacking to secure, and I'm stitching with a seam allowance of 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch. stitching back up to where you left off before. And there we have our stitched lining. So now that we have stitched the bottom of our lining closed, we need to shove that back inside the bag. Just going to push that down in there. And now we just have to close the bottom of our zipper pocket. I like to cut these corners back a little bit just to get rid of some of this bulk. Now I'm just going to poke that seam out. I'm going to pin it so it holds it better. Now I'm going to go over to the sewing machine and I'm going to stitch pretty close to the edge to close off the pocket. With my stitch length at 3.4, I'm just going to close off the bottom of my pocket, stitching pretty close to those two edges and trying to keep them aligned. Always check your pocket seam to make sure that your edges are actually stitched together. I went off a little bit there. I'm just going to redo that little bit because I don't want a hole in my pocket. You could also close this with slip stitch if you wanted to. So now that I have stitched my pocket closed, I'm just going to push that back down in there. Push that corners of the pocket out as much as I can, like that. Now close my zipper pocket up. Just push everything into place. Now all that's left is we're going to do our strap. Retrieving your 60-inch or 152 centimetre piece of strap, I'm just going to seal the ends. You could zigzag or fray stop the ends, but you need to do something, otherwise it'll unravel on you. Some types of straps aren't good for sealing. So now get your slider as well. Place your strap through your slider up over that centre bar. The centre bar is wrong side up. Bring that through. Pull that through about 4 centimetres or 1.5 inches. Approximately, it doesn't have to be exact. And I'm just going to put a couple of clips on there to hold. And now I'm going to go over to the sewing machine and I'm just going to stitch a rectangular box with a cross through it there to secure that strap to the slider. Okay, so I've got my zipper foot on, I've got my stitch length at 3.4 and I'm just going to stitch my slider. I'm going to stitch my slider onto my strap. Actually, I'm going to go this way so that my foot is on the strap. So my stitch length is 3.4. I'll start in the middle, that keeps the edges more better aligned, I think. My strap hardware is quite chunky, so I'm going back of it a bit more than I normally would. It's just too hard to stitch close to it, being so chunky. You also use rivets if you don't want to do this. Okay, so with the wrong side of your strap facing up onto the left hand side, this is the side I'm going to do. I'm putting the wrong side through like that, pulling it through, and then I am going to go through there. So that's the wrong side there. Through there, like that, and pull it through. So it looks like that. Now take the other end over to the other slider, this time coming up from underneath, wrong side together like so. And I am going to now clip that to hold, pulling it through about 1.5 inch or 4 centimeters like before. Stick a couple of clips in there. So that's what your strap should be looking like. Can you see it? If it fits all on the video. And now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and stitch a rectangular box here, or you can rivet. Okay, so now I'm going to very awkwardly stitch a rectangular box onto my strap just to hold it in place. I'm going to move the needle over to the other side like that. Hold these ends. Start in the middle. Just find it doesn't shift the layers so much. And this is why I like to use a thread that blends in with my strap, because if I do a less than perfect job, you can barely see it. So there we go. Alright, I'm going to go and give that a good press, and then we are done. Woohoo!